So welcome everybody. It's great to see you all, and it's great to have more people joining in. I know we have quite a few more people registered too, so if they can't attend live and you're watching this recording, welcome to you too. I'm so glad you could make it. My name is Leah Giorgini, and I'm Executive Director of ISPS-US. And I'm joined today by two amazing advocates, with Deborah Padgett and Eve Garrow, and we're going to be talking today about psychosis and homelessness. Now, this webinar was inspired by, unfortunately, the new legislation in California of care courts, but we will be talking more generally about the topic too, but with a focus on what care courts mean for unhoused people in California and perhaps even in other states. States like California tend to lead the way in legislation, and other states, I'm sure, are taking note and wondering if this will apply for them too. So I think this has a lot of relevance to all of us working across the US or even in different countries. So let me introduce you to our speakers. First, we have Dr. Deborah Padgett, and she has a doctorate in anthropology and is professor at the Silver School of Social Work at New York University. Dr. Padgett is known for her expertise in qualitative and mixed methods and is the author of 2 textbooks in the area. She is an expert on the housing first approach to ending homelessness and is the first author of a book on the housing first developed by Oxford University Press. She has published extensively on homelessness and mental health services in journal articles. I'll also introduce you to Eve Garrow, and she's from the ACLU of Southern California, and she joined there in December 2014. She is a policy analyst and advocate for the Dignity for All project, and her work includes research, policy analysis, public education, and advocacy to promote policy changes that will secure the human right to housing, to end housing displacement and discrimination against people who are unhoused, and to increase the human dignity of all. Her work lies in the intersection of housing justice, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, and disability rights. All those things we passionately care about too. You may wonder why ISPS are kind of getting on board with this. Well, we stand against coercive approaches to psychosis. We really envision a world where people are treated also with human rights and dignity. We believe in people's human rights and psychiatric rights and the movement that's come before us to get us to this place. And we do not want to go backwards. We believe in all different types of approaches to psychosis. We really believe in relationship-focused approaches and things that build up resilience, integration of the experience, and people's understanding. So we're hoping this discussion also leads us down that road of these approaches which could benefit people who are unhoused, and making sure that that is an option for these folks who are now going to go through this process. First up speaking today is going to be Eve, and I look forward to hearing you speak, Eve. You go right ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, and it's just a pleasure to be here. And Leah, I'm glad you mentioned the concern about a dangerous and ineffective model like California's new Care Court Act, the danger that such a model will disseminate to other states, because we share that concern. And that's why it's great to be here today with some of the major stakeholders in this area across the nation to talk about California's experience with Care Court and the broader issues that this brings up. I think what I want to do is start with just before I have a PowerPoint, but before I get into that, just a description of the Care Act and what it is. So this is, make no mistake about it, it is a forced treatment plan. It would create a system, it will create a system of civil courts in every county in California. Those are going to start coming next fall, I think. Like a handful of counties will be implementing the act next fall, and then the rest of the counties in the fall of 2024. A wide range of individuals, including family members, healthcare providers, county workers, law enforcement officers will have the power to refer unhoused people with serious mental health conditions and particularly psychosis, to these civil courts. People can also be referred after a short-term involuntary hold or an arrest. Once in court, the person generally, I expect it will be unhoused people, because the rhetoric around this act frames it as an intervention for unhoused people with psychosis. So once in court, an unhoused person would face a hearing at which they will be represented by counsel. They are going to be expected to present evidence, to call and cross-examine witnesses. And remember, these are unhoused people with disabilities, and appeal decisions. A ruling by the judge in favor of the person making the referral to the court would subject the unhoused person to court-ordered treatment. And that can include medication. The court order will strip people with disabilities of fundamental rights, such as the ability to determine what medications go into one's body, potentially. I also just want to quickly say that the harms of the care court framework, we expect will fall hardest on Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who are routinely misdiagnosed with serious mental health disabilities, and who are also disproportionately targeted by law enforcement once they become displaced from their housing. From our perspective, entangling people in the legal system will traumatize those who are already most heavily impacted by our failed systems, and will perpetuate racial disparities through an adversarial court process that does nothing to address the underlying structural conditions that I will talk about that lead to houselessness. I think that what I will do now, if I am successful here, is move to my presentation. And let me see here. I'm gonna have to share screen. Oops. And go here and share. And then I'm going to move this to slideshow. Let me see here. Let me know if you see it.
Go to view.
View, it's view. Okay, view slideshow. Thank you, Deborah. So yes, the ACLU of Southern California, all of the ACLUs throughout California feel that this is a very misguided strategy. I like to start with not just what we oppose, but what we want, what our North Star is. And at the ACLU, as we share Leah's values, and we believe that everyone deserves equal rights. And if we had a society in which everyone had equal rights, what would such a world look like? Well, from my perspective, it would look like a world in which everyone has the opportunity to participate fully and equally in society, a world in which nobody is discriminated against, stigmatized, and dehumanized for who they are, in which everyone has access to the resources we all need to stay alive and to thrive. And of course, a world in which nobody is living and dying on the streets or in mass shelters and warehouses. And I think on this last point, we agree with California's administration with this Care Court Act is Gavin Newsom's, who's the governor of California, is kind of his baby. And he's, consistently promoting this act as a way to address the issue of people living and dying on the streets. We agree. We just don't think that the CARE Act is the answer at all. In fact, we think it's retrograde. What does the world that we want look like? Sometimes it looks like this. This is the apartment of an impacted person who I work with, a person who's previously unhoused and has serious mental health disabilities. This is permanent supportive housing. So she lives in her own apartment and she has access to wraparound services. A little bit about California. I notice we have people from all over the nation here. Well, California does have a houselessness crisis. We have 12% of the nation's population, but over a quarter of the nation's unhoused population. Astonishingly, we have 50% of the nation's unsheltered population. These are people living in places not fit for human habitation, such as, in tents on sidewalks or in parks, in their cars, just laying, on the ground, things like that. 70% of unhoused people in California are unsheltered, and 80% of chronically unhoused people, these are people who have been unhoused for a considerable amount of time, usually years, and who have serious disabilities. 80% of these folks in California are unsheltered. That's unconscionable. They should not be unsheltered, and they actually should not be living in shelters either. Neither one of these options are appropriate for anyone, much less this population. But 80% of them are living somewhere in an unsheltered location. And one of the reasons I mention this is that those of you who either live or have been in California probably know the houselessness crisis is very visible in California because of this. And that is part, I think, of what has driven these this policy proposal and similar policies. Just the desire to do something, to look like you're doing something, but that something is not actually the solution. We have a housing crisis. I mean, this is the root cause of our houselessness crisis. In California, statewide, the annual income needed to afford a one-bedroom apartment is $65,000 a year. The annual income needed to afford a two-bedroom apartment is $81,000 a year. There are certain, my office is in Orange County, California, which is in Southern California. I can't live there. I cannot afford to buy or rent an apartment in Orange County. So I live elsewhere, and normally I work from home now, but sometimes I commute. It is California is a very, very expensive state to live in. Looking at extremely low income renters, almost 100%, so 89% of our extremely low income renters in California are what we call cost burdened. That means they pay too much for their rent. They pay over 30% of their income to rent. About 3/4 are extremely cost burdened. They pay over 50% of their tiny income to rent, leaving very little for anything else. And what this means is that we have a lot of housing insecurity in California that feeds houselessness. One extra expense can displace people from their housing. And also as a result of this, California has the highest poverty rate in the nation when the cost of living is taken into consideration. So all of these issues, and it's sort of like the root causes, the high cost of housing, have led to this really sort of extreme and exacerbated houselessness crisis. But the other thing that has led to it is a few policy failures, the most immediate of which is that our elected officials just do not have the political will to invest adequately in permanent subsidized affordable housing, not even for people with serious disabilities. And that leaves people living in mass shelters or in unsheltered places for years and sometimes decades. This is a photo of a shelter that was part of an investigation I did. And you can see the living conditions here. I mean, this is not good for anyone, but it's literally intolerable for people with mental health disabilities. And it's not just the physical conditions of the shelter, it's also the way that people are treated in some of these shelters. I mean, enduring verbal abuse, sexual harassment from staff members, things like that. California also has a mental and behavioral health crisis. We have a severe shortage, a workforce shortage, a shortage of psychiatrists, a shortage of mental health workers, a shortage of inpatient psychiatric beds when people need that. People can wait literally, weeks, months, sometimes over a year to access the kind of care that they need. So it's truly a broken system. The problem is really that people don't have access to the humane housing and mental and behavioral health services that they need to recover and to thrive. And so instead of addressing those shortages, what is California's solution at the moment? Court-ordered treatment via the Care Court Act. You may wonder, given that this is really a non-solution, why it passed. And that's kind of what I want to spend some time talking about. There was a lot of, I'm just going to call it propaganda. There was a lot of propaganda around this that really resonates with widely held like stereotypes and myths, both about houselessness and about people with disabilities. And there was also a lot of language in the rollout of this bill during this past legislative session that really sort of like muddied the water, right? So note some of the language that gets used here. This screenshot here is pulled off of the website, California's website for the Care Court Act, which number one is problematically called Community Assistance, Recovery, and Empowerment Act. So I don't see a court order as a form of empowerment, but that's the way this act was framed. So we see in some of this language, we see we see language around, that the CARE Act will increase self-determination of people, who are unhoused with psychosis. It will empower them. It's a form of empowerment. It's a form of care. We see the term community being used a lot. Recovery, the prioritization, of people with the greatest needs, and the idea of like holding ourselves, holding our counties and ourselves accountable to meeting the needs of people. We disagree with this framing of what is essentially a court order for treatment and pushing this sort of like pushing people into a broken system instead of fixing the system. And I would actually reframe some of these terms like prioritization as targeting, as I said, targeting the people who are the most politically powerless, right, with a very coercive program. Holding ourselves accountable, well, maybe in some sense, but when you are subjecting people to a court order, you're really holding them accountable. I mean, come on, right? Any of us, if any of you have been in court before and been subjected to a court order, that sounds like it's holding you accountable, not the system holding itself accountable. So it feels like the language that was used to promote this was very intentional. It was meant to obscure the coercive nature of the program, because that would be the coercive element would be controversial. So here again, I want to just sort of interrogate some of the framing, because I think that in a sense, this is what we were fighting when the ACLU joined with other disability rights, civil rights, and housing justice organizations to oppose the CARE Act. We were really trying to do public education with the general public on the true nature of the bill, cut through some of the framing, the obfuscating framing that the state was using, and sort of like, flip the script. We were somewhat successful in that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But so, for example, when the state said self-determination, we would use a term like coercion and say, how can a coercive program, lead to self-determination? We think it's disempowering, not empowering. When they talk about care, we talk about a court order. They talk about community care, and we talk about really people just being subjected to a civil court. When they talk about prioritizing certain populations, we talk about targeting unsheltered people and Black and Brown people when it comes to a coercive model. And when they talk about holding the system accountable, we talk about holding survivors of a broken system accountable, which is wrong. I want to talk about, just make explicit some of the problematic assumptions of the CARE Court Act. And these are not quotes necessarily, but they're, I spent many months talking to reporters and talking to state legislators and, and keeping up on sort of like the framing of this proposal and the underlying assumptions that drove it. And I think it's important for us to keep these in mind, because these are sort of just like, I mean, as Deborah will say, this is not a new policy. This is a retrograde policy, and we really need to be prepared for the types of justifications that are going to be used and the types of underlying assumptions that really make policies like this popular amongst a wide swath of the population, if we're going to protect the people that we're standing with effectively and sort of like fight alongside of them. So some of the problematic assumptions I heard over and over again. The governor said this incessantly: we've tried everything else. It's time to try something new. And again, it's not new, and we haven't tried everything. We haven't tried like fully funding the types of services that people need in order to recover and to thrive. And one thing that really annoyed me was when elected officials would accuse me or the ACLU of just like, you really care so much about people's civil liberties. That's more important to you than saving this very vulnerable population. You just want to let them, deteriorate and die on our streets. And it's like, no, because that's really a false dichotomy. There is another option, and that is, fully funding our system of care and of, permanent, safe, permanent, affordable, and subsidized housing. A court order will result in better outcomes. I mean, that is a very, very widely held belief. And Deborah will talk about the lack of evidence for that that very, very strong assumption. Similarly, people with disabilities need to be, forced to accept or adhere to treatment because they lack insight, right? And from our perspective, number one, again, there's no evidence for that, and that it is actually morally and ethically wrong to force people to give up their rights in return for the services and housing that they need to stay alive. Treatment will always work. I mean, I think there's a lot of treatment providers in, like listening in today, who know that this is like oftentimes it takes quite a bit of time to figure out what's really going to work for a particular individual, and working like alongside that individual and, within the context of a trusting relationship. There's this underlying assumption I want to talk about, which is that, obviously an act like this assumes that it's just okay. It's ethical. It's fine to take rights away from people who are essentially already oppressed, right? And from the ACLU's perspective, we really see that from the opposite perspective. We believe that we need to be particularly vigilant about respecting and defending the rights of those who are still fighting for the full protections of the Constitution and the law. So policies like this are always a huge red flag for us. I said I would talk a little bit about how we were able to shift the narrative. I mean, the ACLU itself, like here are a few that the editorial page of the major newspapers in California all came out in opposition to this bill. And I think that was in large part due to the advocacy of not just my organization, but the other organizations that we partnered with to oppose this bill. We even had an opinion piece in the New York Times that wasn't an editorial that we pitched to the editorial board, but we did speak with this reporter from the New York Times, who did a very powerful and hard-hitting piece, as you can see by the title of his op-ed on care court. So, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to stop it. I'm going to end my section and then pass it over to Deborah, but I think this is a good segue into what she's going to talk about. This is a quote from a few out of a research article by a few researchers that just to me really hit home when it comes to why service providers, mental health clinicians, psychiatrists, and social workers, and so forth should really be opposed to an empirically baseless model like the Care Court Act. And I'm just going to read it and then stop sharing screen and pass it over to Deborah. So the quote is, "The lack of evidence for patient benefit, particularly when combined with restrictions to personal liberty, is striking and needs to be taken seriously. Clinicians have a duty to provide their patients with treatment in the least restrictive environment. The paucity of rigorous experimental research evidence for such an invasive intervention that has been in use for over 3 decades is quite remarkable. It raises a question of whether this would have been accepted in other branches of medicine. Surely major intrusive interventions in community psychiatry should be expected to conform to the highest standards of evidence. And we made this, Deborah's going to be talking about the research evidence or the lack thereof when it comes to these kinds of coercive outpatient programs. But I just found this to be a very, very compelling quote. I'm going to stop sharing screen and hand it over to Deborah.
Thank you. Let me try to do this magic with the share screen. Hopefully this will work. Oh yeah, share. So I have it on. Okay. All right. Can we see okay? Is he okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eve. That quote pretty much really says it all. But so I'll just say a few things today. You already know sort of who I am, and of course I decided to talk about my positionality, but I'll skip this slide. Let's just say I'm giving away my age by saying that I've been working on research with homeless folks or formerly homeless people for almost 40 years. I've had National Institute of Mental Health research, all qualitative research, and I'm largely basing what I'm saying today about long-term experience with what is known as housing first, and I'm going to assume most of you know what that is, but it's surprisingly missing from this discussion of care courts, so I'm going to draw on that considerably. So let's see. Okay. So the problem, as Eve just described very well, is the belief that homeless people in California who have a serious mental illness are believed to be dangerous, disruptive, and also treatment resistant. So you go down to the blue box. The solution is those care courts. So we've already had that described. I would argue that this solution will not solve the problem and will make the problem, so-called problem, worse, as Eve has described. It's kind of softening the language of what's been around for decades called assisted outpatient treatment, AOT, by and large. So the last box of the 3 points I want to make today is the problem with this solution in the care courts. The first point I want to make is the faulty premise that homeless people with serious mental illness, sometimes I put SMI, lack decisional capacity, and that's really underlying all of these attempts to use the courts and use some form of implied or threatened coercion. The second problem I have with this is the ample research evidence, and Eve has brought this up. I'll go into this a little bit more, but there are numerous studies showing that compulsive treatment, mandatory treatment, care courts, whatever you want to call them, simply do not work. And it's rather shocking that this is coming up at this point in time, because yes, we do look to California in many ways. By the way, I'm in New York City, Eve, so we have our own houseless problem here, except most people are in really bad shelters. The third thing I want to talk about is this movement to put money into court systems is taking money away from valuable needed housing and supportive services. So problem number 1 is that homeless people with serious mental illness lack decisional capacity. Psychiatry even came up with a term for it. I cannot pronounce it, anosognosia, but what it mainly means is that the person lacks insight. In other words, they will not accept they have schizophrenia. My research with many such folks is we accept what they say they have and work from there. And almost always they want help. They just don't want to be told what they have to do and what they have as being some sort of preordained label for them. So heightened potential for violence and harm, these are kind of the faulty premises of the care courts, and the corrective to that for me is the knowledge through this research that persons with serious mental illness do have decisional capacity, but they need some stability in their lives often, and this could be provided with stable housing and supports, also known as Housing First. And to that, I want to add that there's a booming recovery movement in mental health, particularly in psychoses, of advocates, people with lived experience, talking about how frequently people with schizophrenia do get better, some with medication, some without. But the future, the hope of recovery is there, and it is not a lifelong diagnosis that the person must endure. People are still being told that as patients, but it's simply not true. So I'm going to give away that, yes, I've been involved in Pathways to Housing for a long time, and it started here in New York in 1992 as an alternative to being taken from the streets to Bellevue Hospital in a locked ward. And instead, I'm sure many of you know this, so I'll go through it, but Housing First was really premised on first getting the person into housing, then provide wraparound services to help them adjust to living indoors, help them make decisions about their own treatment. And also, it's very much emphasizes harm reduction, which means the person's housing is not contingent on their sobriety. And that is something that gets people going about Housing First. But we have so much research showing that, in fact, being stabilized reduces the use of substances and alcohol. So Pathways to Housing was in business for 22 years. I was president of the board for some of that time before I became more of a researcher. And I used to sort of stay up at night thinking, next time someone pushes someone on a subway tracks, it's going to be a Pathways client and we're going to be inundated. In 22 years, not once has a Pathways client done anything of violence or harm to others. There may have been some talk here and there, but I think this kind of evidence really gets lost in what Eve was talking about, of this kind of use of language to cover up what's really happening. So problem one is decisional capacity. They do have it. They may not be having a good day, but people with schizophrenia do have that capacity. Problem two is the research evidence. This is old wine in new bottles, the care courts. Generally, it's called assisted outpatient treatment. It has other names. It's been around for several decades. It's still very much here in New York, except we never hear about it. And it's certainly, the research is nothing to brag about, since it really doesn't support that AOT works. Again, our observations from our own research is you do not need to use coercion. And in fact, the implication of coercion works against the relationship with the person and with their ability to chart their own course in terms of recovery and getting better. So again, providing housing, then support services. And I mean serious support services. They come to the apartment, they're there 24/7. The research on Housing First has been almost unanimous. It's been across Canada, Western Europe, parts of the United States, show fewer hospitalizations, less need, less likelihood of being arrested, less need for rehab. Most of these folks do have substance abuse problems, and so rehab may be in order, but it is something that's done in negotiation and is person-centered. And the other good news is that Housing First actually costs less than shelter care. And as you saw from that photo earlier, shelter care is really an oxymoron. Shelters are truly antithetical to the needs of people with serious mental illness. So the bottom line for this problem is coercion is not necessary and is even counterproductive. So Eve had that quote. I also found the Cochrane database, which is the sort of formal systematic review of the literature, and they called it compulsory community treatment. But as you can see, the quote there is, they reviewed all the studies of AOT, or in their case, they call it CCT, and they found no difference between the group getting AOT and the comparison group, which was either voluntary care or brief supervised discharge. So without evidence, it's really surprising how evidence-free, I guess I have to say, that people will go in this direction. And it's quite, we call it Kendra's Law, by the way, in New York. named after a young woman named Kendra who was pushed onto the subway tracks. But the irony even of Kendra's situation is that the young man, Matthew Goldstein, that pushed her had been going from clinic to clinic for weeks looking for help and medication and being sent out saying, we have 6-month waiting lists, et cetera, et cetera. So he was desperately looking for treatment when he committed this horrible, tragic act. So my last problem with care courts is that they're actually diverting millions and millions of dollars to the least effective intervention, which is the court system. California already has assisted outpatient treatment. It's called Laura's Law. It's not clear to me why they need this something new. It already has wraparound services. In California, they're called full service partnerships, in which individuals, upon being housed, get the same kind of housing first treatment and working with them towards a better life and controlling some of the problems in their lives. And California, unlike New York, has, through Proposition HHH and others, has made literally billions of dollars available, also working with the federal government. So with all of this money at play, why would we expend valuable funds on a proven failure? And that is my question for you. Thank you. I'll take that off.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And thank you very much, Eve. That was fantastic. Inspired a lot of chat from folks. People are very engaged, wanting to know more of their research and their references. And folks, if you're your conversation going, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A, because we're going to get to those now and start this discussion. Before we get to that, I just wanted to open the opportunity for Deborah and Eve for you to discuss. What are you thinking? What's come up with as you've listened to each other's presentations?
Well, I'll just say, my first husband was an attorney with the Civil Liberties Union, and it's been, I feel very gratified on how the CLU is going into areas that aren't just about legal rights and are actually showing that legal rights are embedded in people's lives. So I really appreciate the take that you've given to this, Eve. Some ACLU chapters are more narrowly, I think, focused, but it was really gratifying to hear.
Thank you. And maybe it's because this is an ACLU affiliate in California, where economic justice and the houselessness crisis and so forth are really top priorities for people and our members, throughout California. But it is true that we were the first. I work for the ACLU of Southern California, and we were the first affiliate in the nation to have an economic justice project. And then my project that focuses on, community members who are houseless, came out of the economic justice project. One thing, and I just think it's such your final question, it's empirically, care court is empirically baseless, it's wasting money, it's a non-solution. Why are we doing it? I think it's such an important question. Why are we doing it? But I feel like we asked the same question in California about what we call the criminalization of people who are unhoused, which is really the go-to, because we don't have housing, for folks. We don't even have the, appropriate mental and behavioral health treatment. None of that is available and accessible in a timely manner. That our local jurisdictions, and sometimes in this case, the state, kind of shift to a model that makes it a crime to be unhoused, or in this case, sort of like hauls you into a civil court, right? If you are just simply a person with disabilities who's living in an unsheltered place, right? And that is a very, very uncomfortable and and to me, terrifying scenario. I think it's a political move. What it does is scapegoat the survivor of the system, right? Instead of the system and the elected officials who have made the political choice, both to defund and then not reinvest in the types of, resources that we need, just like broadly overall. And we call them out for that too.
Could I ask though about the Boise decision in the Ninth Circuit? Because that applies to California.
It does.
That you cannot arrest or cite or give a ticket to someone sleeping unless you have a shelter bed for them.
And so and that is the
Impossible.
Case. So yeah, and that is true. Although we don't have enough attorneys, like civil rights attorneys throughout the state, to like actually enforce it well.
Okay.
But then the other issue is what that has led to. I mean, I think that legal advocates and policy people and activists were really hopeful that would encourage states in the Ninth Circuit and local jurisdictions to invest in permanent supportive housing, right? Because they couldn't just like sort of criminalize people, banish them, right? Like move them into jail or other places. But what's happened instead is like a massive expansion of our shelter system, and not just shelters, but they're really pushing the envelope and trying to say like, well, if we open up like a parking lot where people can pitch their tents, right? Like that's an alternative. And so it's sort of like now what it is like, go to this shelter or get a citation and potentially go to jail. So it's, I mean, what I argue in some of my work is that what it's done is actually create a system in which our homeless services system, short of permanent supportive housing, because we're not like investing more in that, but our shelter system, for example, has now become an arm of the criminal legal system, right? And in fact, it has. Cities and different jurisdictions actually save certain spots just for the police, and terrifyingly, and call them cop spots, and say so that the police can approach people like the people who are going to be referred to care court, who tend to be the most visible of our unhoused population, right? And say, I can give you a citation if you refuse to go to the shelter, which is a completely inappropriate, place for that person to be. Not that being unsheltered is appropriate either, but anyway, so yeah, I think it has probably been marginally helpful, but cities and counties and the state have actually been quite creative in how to sort of work around the margins and continue to criminalize people.
Okay.
Thank you. Deborah, I was curious, a huge portion of your research is based around interviewing folks who are unhoused. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the experiences you've heard from those folks with the mental health system and their experiences with coercion, and whether that helped or hindered their recovery and progress.
Well, let me give you a caveat. I mean, much of my research is people who are in pathways to housing apartments, and then we compared them to people in usual care, which was transitional housing, shelter, and so forth. But we did about 4 years ago a street survey in which we did as much as we could in-depth interviews with about 40 people. And the title of the article is, "If You're Going to Help Me, Help Me," because the bottom line is the city spends a lot of money for outreach workers. And what the outreach workers do is they go up to the person, but they have nothing to offer them other than a shelter bed. And it's true, we do have a lot of shelter beds here in New York. But in speaking to people out, it just echoes pretty much what Eve has been saying. I mean, these individuals want some dignity. And when COVID hit, I was able to work with some advocates who got enough money to put 30 people in hotels, and we interviewed them. And the contrast and just demeanor and tone of voice. Everything was different for these people, because the first time for some of them in 10 or 20 years, they had a shower, or they could lock the door, or they could use the small refrigerator and have nutritious food. So it was kind of a revelation for them. And for many of them, and I have found this in all of my research, those symptoms of psychosis, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, they come and they go. But and some people do feel the medication helps, which is fine. But by and large, the thing that helps them the most is having a stable place to be in. And if the voices get too much, they have someone they can call immediately who will come and talk to them and even take them to the hospital if they say they think they need it. So that people know that exists who live on the street, but they also know that their likelihood of getting it is infinitesimally small. It's kind of like winning the lottery or something. Instead, it should be more or less routine to have people placed in support. These are people who are eligible for supportive housing, and that really started in New York too, which is more or less permanent housing with the supports in place. And New York City, New York State formed an alliance, which is kind of unusual, to use mental health dollars to pay for housing, because we have a huge, multi-billion-dollar Office of Mental Health. And so there have been some innovations here in terms of where public monies can be spent. But what I tend to argue in the book that I wrote about Housing First and when I teach about it is we have an industry, a homeless industry in this city, which pays for thousands of jobs and rather nice executive salaries. And there's a great deal of power in the real estate board. And we've privatized all the development of new housing ever since Ronald Reagan. So we don't have much hope to even fill the gap of all the people that are waiting now. And yes, new people enter into the unhoused realm every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so they say, well, you've housed this many people, but you still got this many people homeless. That's an indictment of our economic system. It's not the functioning of the actual mental health advocates or anyone. It's just the fact that we as a society have chosen to have homeless people, and it's like a game of musical chairs every day.
Yeah. I'm going to just pick up on that quickly and say that we are also living in a neoliberal era where we, with skyrocketing income inequality, mm-hmm. and it is, for our elected leaders in both parties, it's a very difficult decision to advocate for a redistribution, like a more equitable tax structure and a redistribution of resources so that we can actually fund these services, which, as Deborah mentioned, I think in the long run actually save money.
Yeah.
When people are healthy and not showing up with acute illnesses in the emergency room all the time, or requiring expensive inpatient care, things like that, because they're doing okay and they have what they need in order to survive and thrive. So it's more difficult than just apparently than just a non-solution that's going to build off of the types of stigmas that Deborah also mentioned around unhoused people not having insight, being dangerous, these kinds of things, like depicting a very politically powerless group of people as sort of like a public health and safety threat, and therefore we're justified in acting upon them in a very paternalistic and coercive way instead of acting with them and centering their voices and their interests and their lived expertise, right, in the policy debate and the dialogue. And that is just like this keeps me up at night. This is very troubling, it cannot go in a good direction when we're basing our public policies on negative stereotypes about a very marginalized and politically powerless and economically powerless, right? Constituency, like group of people, interest group. And that's why researchers like Deborah and, policy people like me, and I think like everybody who's on this webinar today, I mean, we're the stakeholders who really have to coalesce and stand with people who are impacted and help to center their voices in the policy debate. That's one thing that we really tried hard to do. There's a wonderful organization in California called Disability Rights California. And a lot of impacted people who they have represented, they're a legal advocacy organization, but a lot of impacted people who they have represented and worked with were centered in our advocacy and in public testimony, lots of quotes in op-eds and blogs and things like that. And I think that's going to be really, really critical in our advocacy moving forward, both to continue to try to oppose, a bill that is now become law, but could be overturned at some point, and also to prevent these kinds of policies from disseminating elsewhere to other states.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. One thing I think we haven't touched upon, and I probably should have used this in my introduction. Before I came to ISPS, I spent the last 7 years working in homelessness services, and I have lived experience of being homeless too as a child with my mother. A quote comes to my mind. I think it was from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It's, there comes a point where we have to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And I think that's really pertinent here. Mm-hmm. The care court is meant to be pulling people out of the river to coercion into routes that I don't. It doesn't even do that. It pretends to pull people out of the river.
Yeah, okay.
But there are reasons why these people are in these circumstances in the first place. We've talked about those structural reasons. Eve mentioned, race, how Black and brown Indigenous folks are picked up by the police more often than not once they've lost housing. We've talked about the housing crisis. But there's a reason why people who have these experiences that are labeled as psychosis, schizophrenia, or any other diagnosis, there's a reason why these folks haven't engaged in mental health services. They probably have had some contact with mental health services and found them to be spectacularly unhelpful or coercive, or to promote a kind of treatment that doesn't work for them or feels bad for them, or the side effects with medication far outweigh the benefits.
Yeah.
There's also a reason why they are choosing, some might be deciding not to go into the shelter system. Having worked in the shelter system, I have seen how much stigma there is from folks who are working in that system. Mm-hmm. More than once, I've heard really well-meaning people say, I can't help you if you're not going to help yourself. So I need you to leave the shelter, related to medication compliance, thinking that's the only way that person's going to be better. Or just being completely freaked out because someone is saying they're experiencing voices. Yeah. As the director, I'd say, so what? So they hear voices. Are they hurting anybody? Are they hurting themselves? Are they very distressed? If so, can we support them emotionally with that experience? But that stigma and that fear within the homelessness systems are why people might not want to engage them in the first place. So rather than pulling people out the river, maybe we need to fix these systems in the first place by providing more inclusive, diverse types of treatment or approaches for folks, and to address the housing system, which excludes people in the first place with extraordinary, extreme experiences.
I can go first on this, but I'm curious as to what Deborah thinks as well. I'm reminded of, well, what you're saying is really resonates with me. It's very much in line with my experiences in the investigations that I've done. I did those investigations because we received complaints from people staying in shelters about the abuse and the neglect that they were experiencing in these environments. Vincent Lyon Calo, a medical anthropologist, wrote a wonderful book on exactly what you're talking about. And I think he called it the medicalization of homelessness, where it is reframed, what is essentially like a structural issue is reframed as an individual deficit having to do with like a refusal to deal with your mental health issues or, any other personal issues in your life. Another sociologist whose name I can't remember right now wrote a book called Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders about the homelessness services system in San Francisco, and found the same thing, that the homelessness service providers engaged in either what she called sick talk, which was the same like medicalizing houselessness, or sin talk, which was like you're just a bad person and you need to repent and and reform, and then I guess you'll get housing. But and that structural talk was much less likely among the homelessness services system because there was no housing for people to transition to. So they were basically just engaged. The service system was engaged in this project of trying to like personally reform their clients, right? And like you, I mean, I find that the people I work with, they're offended. They feel like they're being gaslighted. I mean, it is such a broken system. They can't get what they need. They're already on years-long waiting lists for housing, and it's like, and like I said at the beginning of the presentation, they don't make, they're unhoused. A lot of them have disabilities, they don't make, the $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year that you need to afford market rate rent in Southern California. So, so that being subjected to that, it's depoliticizing. Like I think about the women's movement and the saying like the personal is political. What they're doing is taking the political and reframing it as a personal problem. And once you depoliticize a problem, that's a political project too, right? Is like trying to convince the people most impacted by a policy failure that this isn't a policy failure, this is your problem. You created this problem for yourself, or it's because of something about you. And so if you are able to, accept our services and reform yourself, then you will, escape houselessness. And it's really, yeah. So anyway, that's what I have to say about that. I guess it's just like another way of agreeing with you that it's pernicious, it's harmful to people. I think it's harmful to their mental health too. I mean, I work with a group of women who most of them are previously unhoused, and they are like, they've been housed for a couple of years now, most of them, and they are still like working through the trauma of basically like the way they were treated by service providers, the gaslighting and the sort of like scapegoating and blaming them for being unhoused.
I just wanted to say one thing about the prevalence of mental illness in the unhoused population of America. Time and again, mental illness is, you see more mental illness because these are the people that end up more often on the street. But overall, it's about 30% of all homeless people have a serious mental illness. So that leaves 70% that do not. Now, that's not to say they don't have trauma and anxiety and depression, but they don't fit the criteria for the serious mental illness, and that has to be taken into account if we're planning housing anyway. But I'm happy to to put people with mental illness near the front of the line because of the suffering they're going through. But I just want to give you another number. You were talking about how much, 65,000 a year or something well, New York City pays $3,000 a month for every little shelter cot. Now imagine what you could rent in New York City, at $3,000 a month. You could actually rent an apartment.
You could rent an apartment of a 1-bedroom apartment or a studio apartment in Southern California for $3,000 a month. Like just a voucher, that covers somebody. Yeah, that's.
I'm just saying. This is what we're doing. We're spending all this money over here when it's needed over here. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have questions from the floor?
We do. I'm about to get to those. Before we get to those, I just want to give a quick plug. Our annual conference is coming up in November, from the 4th to 6th of November. And we're actually having a panel discussion about care courts and continuing this conversation.
Cool.
So if you want to talk more about this, learn more about this, and also learn a diverse range of perspectives related to psychological and social approaches to psychosis, then check it out. Check out our website, ISPS-US.org, to see more about the conference. We also sent out a press release, which I linked in the chat earlier, but I'll link again. We've invited the mayor of Sacramento to join us for this panel. He's a huge mental health advocate. He's done a lot of activism related to mental health legislation. But he's in support of care courts. So we're hoping to invite and call him in and learn different perspectives related to this, and maybe that'll make some impact in how it will eventually be implemented within Sacramento. All right, so let's get to questions from the floor. So I'm just going to go right from the top, and if you have questions, I see some hands raised. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. That is how we'll get to those. So Yulia asks, this is a question for Eve, do ACLU and HRW, which participated in the No Care Court Coalition, plan a wider involvement in the issue of psychiatric coercion, like nationwide campaigning beyond California?
I mean, the answer is yes, and it's already kind of started. We're in a little bit of a like taking like a little bit of a breather since the care court bill was passed into law. But a smaller group of us has already started reaching out, actually, to state to representatives in different states, to kind of just like educate them on what's happened in California, give them the heads up, and do sort of like an educational campaign as to like why this is actually a really bad idea. We think that California is going to be a cautionary, example moving forward. So in that sense, yes, we are already like reaching out to other states to just preemptively educate them on why, even though this just sailed through the state legislature in California, like why it's a bad idea. We're also gearing up for implementation monitoring, which, as I said, will start happening next year. These civil courts will start coming online probably next fall, and we think it's going to be really important to monitor the implementation of these civil courts and the true impact on people who are going to be entangled in and pulled into this court system. And that's sort of it will give us data and information that will both feed into our policy advocacy around this, but also potential legal advocacy.
Great, thank you. The same person has asked if she can connect some students with you, because she's about to give a short talk on care courts and mental health policies at a meeting of student governments of the California university system.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, question for you both. How is care court fundamentally different from drug courts? And what's your position on drug courts?
I'll let you.
It's a whole nother
You know, all I can say about drug courts is they have a far more rigorous set of demands. You know, urine testing, and you know, they monitor drug use in ways that you can't monitor mental health. You can monitor the service use, I imagine, but that's a good question, actually. I mean, I think the idea of drug courts was pretty good, and that it was diversion from incarceration, as far as I know. But I haven't seen research. I'll have to say I don't know the research on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess all I'd say about like what's the difference, I think Deborah's right. The difference is that it is diversion, usually from jail. And so the enforcement mechanism then for compliance with your treatment program, I mean, there's the monitoring, like the type of monitoring that Deborah mentioned, but the enforcement mechanism is that you would go back to jail, right? If you were not in compliance with the treatment program. So it is diversion, and it's sort of like in lieu of, or sometimes I think it's also like in lieu of being charged. Right. So like you're not charged with a drug crime. Instead, you go to this court and you have to comply with the treatment program. And then if you fail to comply or you drop out or something, then you're going to be charged with a crime. With care court, I think we mentioned this, but the compliance mechanism is really that what you don't have to, number one, you don't have to commit a crime. That's a huge difference, right? in order to be pulled into care court, this is you just have to have, be diagnosed with some form of psychosis. And generally it's going to be, we think, people living on the streets.
I will say one thing about the care courts as I was reading it is they're going to be monitoring, right? These folks take medications. They may be relying more on injectable antipsychotic medication, like Haldol or some of the new ones. And I have to say, from my research, those are very painful. I mean, they last for a month, right? So you can just shoot them up with medicine and don't have to, supposedly they're going to be calmed down for a month. But the people that we've interviewed are terrified of those injections. They're extremely painful, and the side effects are brutal. So I'm worried that's going to be a care court go-to, because then they can have them medicated for a month.
Yes, that may actually be another difference between, like Deborah, I'm not like super familiar with drug court, but I don't know that medications are ever prescribed and required as a condition of being in a drug court. So it feels like the type of treatment that may be ordered by the court is much more invasive than, when it comes to care court than for a drug court. And then I guess the last thing I was going to say is that the compliance mechanism would not be to go to jail or to be charged with a crime unless you're referred to care court in lieu of going to jail, which is another pathway to care court. The compliance mechanism is that the judge could refer you to conservatorship proceedings, and that just like that amps up like the coercive nature. If it becomes a pipeline to conservatorship, which strips people of almost, all of their rights and all of their decision-making capacity over their own lives, then it's, you're just seeing like an extremely coercive model here. And I will be extremely curious to see if that's what we're predicting, but if that actually happens.
No.
I'm curious, and maybe I need to do some more reading, but upon whose judgment are people saying that someone is psychotic?
It has to be a psychiatrist, and it's very clear in the care court language. And that's one of the difficulties of care courts and AOT is just finding psychiatrists who will put the time in to go to a court. and attest to that person, because mental health system is so overburdened and so unresponsive that that's probably going to be a problem. But it has to be a psychiatrist. It cannot be anyone else.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. I work with a housing first agency. And I'd love for you to discuss what to do for clients who are unable to maintain housing, even with wraparound services and supported housing.
Okay, I have to come at that with two things. First is people sometimes, and no offense to this person, but people sometimes say they're practicing housing first, and they're not fully, harm reduction, patient-centered, and so forth. But assuming this place is, my experience through Pathways is, yes, some people mess up and they violate the tenant requirements and they're evicted, but then Pathways found them another apartment. I know it sounds almost impossible, but back in the 90s and 2000s, you could do that. If a person is really seriously psychotic, usually they will agree, or the Pathways people will urge them to consider a brief hospitalization. The key is they hold their apartment for them. So they're not going homeless. Just, going to a hospital can make you homeless for many people. So I'm wondering if these people, if everything has been done possible and in the correct way. But all the research is 80 to 90% of people get better and get stabilized. And so then you could ask, well, what about those 10 to 20% and all those randomized controlled trials that have been done? And Canada researchers actually looked at that and said there's no one characteristic of a person that we can identify that will make them not work and make housing first not work for them. Nothing, not substance abuse, not family history. So I'll say, why don't we go with something with an 85% track record? I mean, if it were a drug trial, it would have been over a long time ago with an 85% success. And yet here we have this, and people don't want it. People in power, at least.
Yeah, the only thing I agree with all of that. The only thing I would add, I did a case study of a permanent supportive housing program in Southern California when I was a postdoc fellow. I'm racking my brains trying to remember the name of the article that we published, but it's in Social Service Review, like in 2016. And what we found was that quite often people were like, they lost their housing or they were evicted because they were violating what property managers framed as house rules. They were actually sometimes symptomatic, and their social workers, their case managers who were assigned to them recognized that. But the framing that, this was like a house rule violation and sort of 3 violations and we're going to start eviction proceedings or something like that, overruled the professional expertise and evaluation of the case managers, which was really problematic. And then of course the residents themselves had very little say or power in how they wanted to frame their own sort of symptomatic behavior. And because of that, the people who probably needed permanent supportive housing the most were the ones who were getting evicted, because they became from time to time, symptomatic, and let's say stayed up all night, or, did what, their music was too loud, or, something that it's sort of okay, you're symptomatic. The whole purpose of permanent supportive housing is to, the recognition that people are going to be symptomatic sometimes and just need additional services or, support, right? So anyway, I mean, part of it, I think too, is just, being, within your own program, making sure that people are like leaving permanent supportive housing or being sort of like, also the only other thing I'll say is that most of the time people weren't evicted. This was in Los Angeles County, and the housing authority rule there was that if you are evicted from permanent supportive housing, you don't qualify for subsidized affordable housing for 5 years. And so you can't even like get on the list again for 5 years. So all it really took was the threat of eviction for people to be like, okay, I'll just pack up and leave, right? So, and we wouldn't have known that because that those were like informal practices unless we were in there, like, you know, in the organization and talking to the residents and sitting in on the meetings between the property managers and the case managers and things like that. So I think part of it is just like being a reflective organization and really thinking about your own practices and whether or not you're adhering closely to the housing first model, right?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is having good relationships with landlords, and
Yeah.
you know, I favor the housing first model, which is scatter site, which is people living in apartments with other people, and those other people also stay up all night and have loud parties, you know, that kind of thing. The difference is that the landlord has a number to call.
Yeah.
If the toilet stopped up,
Mm-hmm.
or if the person is smoking marijuana, the landlord will call, so they have someplace to go. Plus, they get the rent paid every month, without a doubt.
Yes.
So I understand that people can behave, you know, in ways that are rather scary or fearful, but again, usually the stability happens in such time, or pathways would move them to another apartment. But
Yeah.
landlords tended to like it. Small landlords that we worked with here in New York.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. How do proponents of care courts justify impacting already over-encumbered inpatient systems and LPS mental health courts? In Alameda County, we already do 400 plus LPS hearings a month and have a shortage of hearing officers.
Wow.
They don't justify it. They don't, the proponents of care court don't talk about that. About the fact that our system is already overburdened. In fact, Governor Newsom says, you know, we've just invested all of this money, you know, in the system, and now we just need to get people into it, right? And it's not true. I mean, they have invested some money in the system, but not nearly enough to meet the needs of even the most vulnerable, you know, people who are out there. And so it's kind of like a matter of scale too, right? Like a few $1 billion can sound like a lot of money to the general public, but when it's like you do the numbers, or you do the math, it's like, well, it's going to help like 3% of all people who are like unhoused on any given day, right? Which is like not all of the people who are unhoused over the course of the year, even not even close. So, yeah, that's part of the problem. And thank you for mentioning that. That needs to be part of the conversation, because the conversation or the public debate about policy proposals like this need to be empirically based. They just need to be empirically based. And I think the reason I went through all of the assumptions in the PowerPoint part of the presentation is that instead it was really based on these unfounded assumptions that were just, it became like, in my view, a form of propaganda for a policy that's just not going to work for all of the reasons that we've talked about.
Is he doing this, Newsom, as part of his national visibility in case he might want to run for president? I don't mean to sound too cynical, but
I mean, I can't read his mind, but this was really his signature policy this year. It wasn't generated from state legislators. It came out of the governor's office. He did get obviously like a state senator and an assembly member to co-author the bill. The director of Mark Galley of the California Department of Health and Human Services just promoted this up and down the state, had sort of had preemptive meetings with us and other disability right and civil rights organizations to try to be like, no, this is going to be really great. You don't understand, and that kind of thing. I mean, to me, what that means is that this is a signature policy for him. And who knows? I mean, I believe he has aspirations to become president of the United States or, something like that. So yeah, I do think he's, cynically, I also believe that this is at least in part, a political gambit on his part.
On a similar strain of thought, we had a few comments and questions related to if we know if who has financial interest in this bill and what lobbying has been done perhaps by those folks to make this bill happen.
Financial interest. Oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No, that's a good question. I mean, what I'm hearing is people at the county level who have to implement this are pulling their hair out because there really isn't money allocated for housing. So to me, just the way this thing is structured is it's going to be a mess. Because if they're not allocating money for housing, what is a care court going to do if they're on the street? Even if so-called works, they're going to go back to the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Because there isn't any housing waiting for them. And the end game just never comes up in these discussions of what's going to happen with these care courts. I mean, we could go into broader, or I could go into some of my structural upstream thoughts about who owns prisons and incarcerations, and a lot of mentally ill people are in prisons today. But this new institute, the Cicero Institute, is putting out tons of papers and paid for by a billionaire arguing against housing first and really coming down hard. So there's opposition to it, but I honestly don't quite know the financial angle, except there's not enough money being allocated to really realistically to do it in the first place.
Yeah, and I guess what I would add to that is that there's not enough money being allocated, and that is by design. And so when you think of like the top 1%, right, the people who really or the interest groups and individuals and corporations that really benefit from our unequal our unequal system, and the massive concentration of wealth and income among a very tiny but powerful group of people. Any policies like the true solutions, right, that we've been talking about, that will involve the redistribution of wealth and income and will necessitate a more equitable tax structure, are not what they want. And so policies like this, or the criminalization of people who are unhoused, to just sort of like try to disappear the symptoms of a really broken system, right, are what they tend to be in favor of and support. I also know this doesn't have anything to do with the financial interests, but NAMI was a big supporter of the bill. And I think that speaks to sort of the desperation of the families of people with disabilities who just, like within a service environment, that just is not meeting their needs, just like wanting something, anything to connect their loved ones to, to care, and not understanding the research around this, and that it's, a court order is not going to be the panacea that people think that it's going to be. And then the other group, super problematically, but the really big politically connected homeless shelters, like organizations that run like some of the biggest homeless shelters in downtown Los Angeles and things like that. We're huge proponents, and we're often like quoted and by the supporters of the bill as to why it was very necessary. So
again, that just goes back to my experience of homelessness providers not necessarily knowing how to best support people with these kinds of experiences or having stigma related to them.
What happens if homelessness ends? Where are they going to be?
Yeah.
We should all be working to do ourselves out of a job.
Yeah.
But you're right. Some people don't want that to happen.
No.
Have the care court proposals indicated what kind of treatment will be available? Is their primary intervention pharmaceutical?
That's heavy. That's going to be heavily the treatment, because not taking medications is a real issue for it's supposed to be a sign that they have laid-like insight, and therefore they are mentally ill because they refuse the medication. But the side effects of these medications are horrendous. And in the older ones, you got tardive dyskinesia with tremors and uncontrolled body movements. With the newer generation of antipsychotics, you gain weight, you get metabolic syndrome, diabetes. They're very, in some ways, very toxic. They can help with the voices, but the medications, and this is a big pharmaceutical. Speaking of people profiting, the pharmaceutical. And as I mentioned earlier, I fear they're going to use more injectable antipsychotics so that they can send them away for a month and whatever. And everyone we spoke to found that to be extremely demeaning, much more stigmatizing than giving them a bottle of pills.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cruel. I don't see the utility.
I think that's such an important point, what Deborah just mentioned. This really worries me too. I mean, I think another underlying assumption is just like, let's say the assumption that a court order does result in, greater, receipt or engagement with treatment. There's this other assumption that treatment, some treatment, any treatment is like a panacea, and all we need to do is connect people to it. And I think what Deborah is describing, like, reminds me or helps remind us that treatment is really, it requires a very close and trusting relationship between the client and the provider, because of all of these unintended consequences, the side effects that can arise from taking these very powerful psychotropic medications, and it takes I don't know, anyway, I can only imagine, and I do think that some of the research shows that instead of sort of creating a more trusting relationship between the therapist or the service provider and the patient or the client, like what a court order actually does is erode trust, and the service providers then actually use the court order as a way to try to enforce compliance. And I don't know what the research shows about this, but I could only imagine that sort of like disrupts that communication between the patient and the client, right? Where you really need that patient's input and feedback in terms of like how this treatment is going,
That
whether,
relationship is pivotal.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
It's not just the medication. Yeah.
So anyway, like I just think when we were having a discussion like before the actual webinar, I was mentioning that this whole like sort of like challenging all of these notions of this really simplified idea that's being perpetuated by this by care court, and also like all of the framing around it is not very helpful, because treatment is like way more complicated and just does require that very close relationship between the provider and the client. It's way more complicated than the notion that is promoted through this policy.
Housing helps your mental health, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Yes,
Not
and homelessness
surprisingly.
is not good for your mental well-being. Yes.
It's amazing. Houselessness is bad for your mental health. Housing is good for your mental health.
Who knew? And solutions such as rapid rehousing or pent-up supported housing, where you can have your own space, is better for your mental health than being in the shelter system, which is extremely stressful. Extremely stressful.
Well, I had an official who with Department of Homeless Services here in New York, and we were talking about Bellevue and how horrific it is. It's the intake shelter for men. And he said, well, we don't want them to get comfortable here. So you're designing a shelter to be a hostile almost environment.
Mm-hmm.
If they get comfortable, they might stay for years. Some of them do end up staying for years, but they're not comfortable. They're miserable. I mean, I find that almost like a catch-22. We do have a legal right to shelter. Yes, we do have that. But they're making those shelters, it's almost deliberate that they're unpleasant.
The shelter that I showed you all an image of, they had a rule that you couldn't lay down on your cot during the day. You had to stay sitting up. And that's a good example, right? And that if you, like, one of the women who appeared in who was part of my investigation and appeared in the report that I wrote, she contracted pneumonia, not surprisingly, and while she was living there, and she had to go get a doctor's note in order to get permission to lay down on her own cot during the day when she had a raging fever, and was just like as sick as anything.
Well, here they have to leave in the morning and drag their belongings and hang out during the day and then come back at night. Not even allowed in the shelter during the day.
That's inhumane.
Yeah.
Okay, well, final question before we wrap up, because I know the time. We've reached the time. There's been quite a lot of discussion about family members. So family members not knowing what to do outside of pushing towards a coercive approach. What advice or what have you seen that could be a good approach for family members to take?
That's just such a hard one, because it really is, it gives you pause to think about, first of all, for people who don't have schizophrenia, but do have other mental issues, they're almost impossible to gain access to. There's a public sector, which is overburdened and has long wait lists, or you pay $400 an hour for a psychiatrist or a psychologist, which is about the going rate, $400. I mean, so the system is really not set up very well. But ideally, the member of the family and the family themselves can find a therapist or someone who can work with that person, including medications. And there are some groups, day groups and places that some people like, day treatment things. But my heart goes out to family members, because I realize these things happen, and we have a very woefully underfunded, understaffed mental health system in this country.
Yeah. The only thing I would add, and I agree with that, is that family members are really well positioned to be part of the disability rights movement, and
Good.
because they have the stories. I mean, they know firsthand, as well as their impacted, loved ones, that this is a very, very frustrating system. And I would love to see more family members be part of the movement, give testimony at like Senate and Assembly hearings and things like that, because their voices and their experiences could be a real game changer, as well as including the voices of impacted people. I mean, they are impacted too, because they are often the tireless advocates for their loved ones, and really trying to navigate such a broken system.
Absolutely. There's a few people responding in the chat too about this, and mentioning some really promising or even well-researched models that exist mostly outside of America: Soteria houses, peer respites, open dialogue approach. And we strongly believe at ISPS are advocating for a greater adoption of these approaches, increase the choice that people are given, and increase options for both people experiencing these experiences and also family members looking for support and services.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're out of time, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. This has been a great discussion. I'm all fired up. I'm ready to do something about it. And if you are too, don't forget to look into our conference. It's happening in just over a week's time. Oh my goodness, I'm not ready, but I am ready. So join us. Check out our website, ISPS-US. Check out our previous webinars. We've already had some webinars about open dialogue, etc. And let's just keep up this fight and making our voices heard in this care court discussion ongoing.
And thanks to Leah and Deborah, and also to the great questions.
Yep.
Yes, great questions. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.